Hello, welcome to another episode of History Hack. Alex is bouncing off the walls today. Go on, Alex. Who have we got?
This is great. So neither of us can tell you much about this person, but they came on Twitter and revealed their speciality, and we were like, we must have him. So Ian Boyd is here.
Rephrase that. You said you got so excited.
No, I sent you the message and you went, oh my fucking God, yes! Because this man is an expert on sinkholes, but it's way more fun than it sounds. Ian, welcome. And tell us a bit about yourself and exactly what your speciality is.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's great to be here. It was just funny how that tweet kind of, took off.
I'm guessing this doesn't usually work with girls where you go, well, yeah, I write about sinkholes and they just fall at your feet.
Yeah, typically not. So my name's Ian Boyd. I'm a first-year PhD student at Cambridge. I'm in Queen's College, and I am working on sinkholes at the moment. Sinkholes in Paris in the 18th century, and hoping to turn that into a larger project about how people thought about time and space in the 18th century. But for the moment, I'm just all in on the sinkholes.
This is brilliant. So essentially what you tell us is that Paris is built on really bad ground for building a city. And in the 18th century, it started falling into random sinkholes.
Yeah, I mean, that's the gist. It's ironically built on excellent ground for building cities, yet also terrible ground, because the reason it's falling over is because it was built on a bunch of limestone and gypsum. So perfect building material.
Yeah.
And as that gets taken out, you're left with a blank space. And
so 1774 is when the first sinkhole appears in Paris. What happened? How did it happen? Where? And what was everyone's reaction?
Yeah, so good question. So the 1774 sinkhole is the first really big one that we all talk about. And it occurred in a part of Paris known as the Rue d'Enfer, or the Barrière d'Enfer, which in English means the street of hell. So that's a pretty appropriate place for the kind of portal to the underworld to show up and swallow everyone.
Yeah, there's a whole Buffy the Vampire Slayer vibe going
yes,
already, isn't
exactly.
there?
It actually was called the Hellmouth at the time. So this is very much Buffy. So this is in the kind of the left bank of Paris. If you're familiar at all with how Paris is kind of designed, we're in the 14th arrondissement.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've ever visited the Catacombs on the Place d'Enfer, that's exactly basically where this 1774 sinkhole happened.
This is a posh part of Paris, isn't it?
Yes, yes it is. It is now. At the time, this is right at the edge of Paris, so this was the main tax gate into the city. So in 1774, it would have been packed with people, horses, carriages, you name it. If you were going to enter the city to sell your goods, you were going to come through that gate.
I'm envisioning this massive hole in the ground just opening up and swallowing everything up.
Yeah, that's basically how it happened. So around 3 p.m. on the 17th of December, there was kind of a loud shaking and creaking, and just a massive hole opened up that was around 20 meters long, and just an entire city block had just sunk into the ground in a matter of seconds. All the houses for a quarter mile along the Rue d'Enfer had just been pulled down into earth.
Oh my God, that's not even just like a couple of stalls in the market. A whole city block just vanished into the ground.
Yep. Yeah, these sinkholes got pretty deep. Some of them went as far as 80 meters. 80 feet, which is pretty terrifyingly deep.
So literally a whole city block just dropped into it. It must have been absolute chaos.
Yeah, so we don't really know. I haven't come across any sources of from 1774 exactly what people thought the day after, but every single source that mentions 1774 mentions the abject terror that people felt right afterwards. We have the Journal of Paris, which is a newspaper that kind of didn't exist in 1774, but existed a few years later. Anytime sinkholes come up, they're like, hey, remember how terrifying 1774 was? Charles-Axel Guillemot, who we'll kind of talk about later, because he's very important for this conversation, every time he mentions 1774, he always follows it up with the wave of terror. So yeah, must have been terrifying.
So literally in the space of a few seconds, this block-wide hole appears in the middle of Paris, up to 80 feet deep, and everything on top of it disappears. Do we know what the death toll was?
Not of the 1774 one. And these
There's just no precedent, is there?
Yeah, not of this size. I find it hard to think based off of just how Paris geography is that a sinkhole had never happened before in an earlier period. But this is the first really major one. And part of that we can kind of get into later. We're talking about the expansion of Paris as a city and more urban kind of urbanization. But yeah, this is the first big one. And death tolls only tend to be around the teens.
Yeah.
So not as many as you would expect.
I can imagine it being incredibly terrifying. You're standing there doing your shopping or making lunch or whatever you're doing at the time. Suddenly the ground shakes and then everything is just completely swallowed up. I can't imagine.
Yeah. No, it must have been absolutely terrifying. There's a story from later period, so in the 1800s, I think it's 1866. Don't quote me on that year, but in the 1860s, of a man who just the entire front of his apartment falls off of his house, and he's just sat there about to eat his dinner, and he's just not moving because he's probably petrified.
That is insanity.
Yeah.
So this is happening, you're saying, because of extracting building materials from underneath?
Yeah. So, so to talk about, I guess, so a sinkhole really in general is just any type of hole in the ground caused by like a collapse of the surface layer of dirt. But I think for the Parisian context, I'll try to keep it brief. So millions of years ago, the area that is now Paris was kind of an underwater ancient sea. This is called the Anglo-Paris Basin. And I'm not 100% a geologist, but it's safe to say geology happened. And this ancient sea, as it kind of dried up and became what is now Paris, left behind a lot of sedimentation, so like gypsum and limestone, which is fantastic building material. Of course, a lot of the limestone that was dug out of this kind of southern part of Paris, which is where all these sinkholes start happening, was used in the original building of Notre Dame and of the Louvre. It's kind of a fun connection. But if you've ever heard of plaster of Paris, that's basically just gypsum. And all of that gypsum comes from the southeastern side of Paris. So excellent building material. Unfortunately, forgotten about quarrying. So they kind of start in the Gallo-Roman period. They're starting to mine the exposed rock. Pretty quickly on, it's becoming clear that you need to dig down into what's called a room and pillar technique. So you build like a deep shaft into the earth and then build out horizontally from there. And they started doing that probably around the 12th century, and they didn't stop doing that until 1741. So we've got a few hundred years of just Paris being kind of tunneled out from underneath. And as these tunnels are kind of forgotten about, we're then building houses. Since this is all happening underground, these tunnels are forgotten about, and then we're just building houses on top of them.
Did they make the link in 1774 as to why it happened, or was it just like an act of terrifying godliness?
Yeah, so there's terrifying godliness is an interesting you say that. It was considered a diabolic action. And there was a lot of sources saying it was diabolical. And yeah, it was attributed definitely to some type of otherworldliness, because there's no government action on this until 1776, when the Ministry of Finances is kind of tasked with figuring out what to do. So
you've mentioned him before, a few moments earlier. So Charles-Axel Guillemot, he experiences a sinkhole in 1774, doesn't he? So can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, I'm sorry, 1777 actually, but yes, it's his first day on the job, on the 24th of April, 1777. He's just rolling around on his in his carriage on his way to the site of the 1774 sinkhole because he's a pretty dedicated guy. It's his first day. He's going to go check out the site of the 1774 sinkhole, and on his way there, about a half a mile from where that original 74 sinkhole appeared, another one happens. And there's a 20-foot hole again that goes down probably 70 feet. And that very day, Guillemot jumps into the hole. He gets a rope and he goes and goes down because he's looking for what's called a fontis, which is basically just a crack. And he's looking for more of these. And it's really him who starts to decide that we need to map out the catacombs, or map out these tunnels and figure out where they go, where these ancient quarries are coming from.
So there's another one in 1778, isn't there? What happens here?
Yeah, so the 1778 one is an interesting one because it appears definitely the most in journalism, because this is kind of a period in French journalism where there's been a little bit less censorship from the government. So straight away, Guillemot in 1797 writes a memoir, which is extremely useful for understanding a lot of this. And he writes in his memoir that the 1778 sinkhole caused the same fear of the 1774 sinkhole and sent another wave of fear across Paris. So on July the 27th, 1778, in the suburbs of Paris in a region called Ménilmontant, today this is just part of Paris, has completely been taken over. Mm-hmm. The sinkhole opened and instantly just killed 7 people. They just fell down. It was an entire family and then some other people. Really, really horrible and sad. And they knew that no one could have survived that, so the search for their bodies went on from the day of the sinkhole, the 27th of July, to the 14th of August, which is 25 days.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and this got a lot of updates in the news. So in the Journal de Paris, they had 6 little updates in between 14th of August and 27th of July, where basically they're talking about who was pulled out of the rubble today, what they had done in their life. And there was also a lot of rumor squashing. So twice in these updates does the government and does actually Guillemot himself kind of squash some of the rumors. So he says that none of the workers have died in this excavation. No one has been severely injured. And we're all working very, very tirelessly. And it's interesting, I think, that there's so much time dedicated to these rumor squashing because it shows that indeed people in Paris were frightened. There was probably a lot of rumor going around that the government couldn't get a hang of taking care of this issue and that Paris at any moment could just fully collapse into itself.
Well, this is the thing. This is a 4-year period where it started happening, where literally people in Paris think that you're just going about your business and suddenly you might drop into a massive hole.
Yeah.
And die.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I haven't come across anything that said somebody has fallen into a sinkhole and survived.
Yeah.
It does seem to basically just be a death sentence.
Yeah.
So Guillemot gave a speech every single evening after the work had been done for the day at the site of the sinkhole. And it seems that he would just talk about how motivated everybody was, how impressed he was with his workers, how competent everyone was. And this is really like the rhetoric of somebody who's trying to remain calm and giving assuring demeanor to the public. Interestingly, from his private notes, we can know that he's worried a lot about funding. He's really, really concerned that the government is going to cut his funding because he basically admits there's no way for him to say how much money this is going to cost because he doesn't know how many tunnels there are.
Yeah.
He doesn't know where they go, and he doesn't know how dangerous they are until he goes there. And then he says even if they do all get properly secured, it's going to require constant vigilance to ensure that the tunnels remain secure. So he's constantly worried about funding because the French government at the time, of course, is going through some pretty big financial issues. And interestingly, too, he wonders if people can even take an unseen threat seriously. There's the risk, right, of falling into a hole and dying, but you can't let that move you out of Paris, right? You still have to keep your daily life.
Well, yeah, you can't just rebuild Paris somewhere else and start again, can you?
Yeah, exactly. So it was this kind of really difficult situation where there is this invisible imminent threat, yet it's kind of hard to act upon because it's not like it's an invading army or something you can clearly face on. It's just something you need to spend money to fix.
So Guillermo, he actually ends up in prison, doesn't he? How does he end up there?
Yeah. So I guess in just a few words, I would say it's personal workplace drama. That's just gone much, much too far. So to kind of tie back into the concerns about funding, there were always accusations. So before Guillermo comes into his office as the Inspector General of the Tunnels of Paris, which is a really, really long title. It's actually it's the Inspector General of the Quarries of Paris and the surroundings. Before he's in that office, there was this other guy, Inspector Dupont, who is a mathematics professor. And he's also tied to the Bureau of Finances. And when Guillermo comes in, Guillermo has some pretty choice words for Inspector Dupont. He thinks that Dupont hasn't done a very effective or good job at maintaining the problem because there's a 1777 sinkhole, there's a 1778 sinkhole. Clearly, the government hadn't been handling the problem for the first year. So 1776 is when the government decides we've got to do something. 1777 is when Guillermo comes in. So for that 1 year when the government had attempted to fix the sinkhole issue, they really didn't make much progress, mainly because Dupont, Guillermo's opinion, didn't know what he was doing. And this, I think we can probably agree with without taking too much sides because it is history and these guys are dead, so it doesn't who was wrong. But there's a story that Guillermo tells to the administration of Paris where he says that he was pretty shocked to see Dupont attempting to force a sinkhole to occur by hitting the street with a metal rod.
It's got to be like needle in haystack job though, right? Scientific. Yeah. It's not very scientific.
No. So Guillermo is more convinced the way to go is to actually go into the tunnels and map them out and see where there's cracks in the walls and such, which does make a bit more sense. So yeah, Dupont gets taken off, and there's just a really high level of like professional jealousy from Dupont, and he's constantly trying to undermine Guillermo by saying that he's squandering money. We see in 1789, so the revolution's really starting to kick off, some kind of exiling and replacements in the French government left a vacuum of power, and Dupont immediately begins spreading rumors that Guillermo has been really embezzling money, treating workers unfairly, which is arguably true because Guillermo did have a no-strike policy, which in 1789 wasn't playing too well. This led to several lawsuits against Guillermo, and he was indeed arrested kind of near the end of 1790 for embezzling money. But pretty quickly, this was only a few months, he was released from his imprisonment. And we don't know exactly if he was sent to prison or just sent under house arrest. But the allies in the government for Guillermo got him out of prison or his imprisonment and actually got Dupont to be surveyed and exiled from the government of France. So it was really just professional jealousy that led to him spending time in prison. But
it's just nonsense, isn't it?
That's always the case, though, really, isn't it? Somebody gets jealous. Oh, let's just chuck him into prison.
Yeah, it's very, very odd. There is really no truth to the to the concept of Guillemot embezzling money, or there's no evidence for it. It was just he needed money to fix the tunnels underneath Paris, but he wasn't even getting too much money. It was pretty reasonable.
So you've already mentioned that the French government is strapped for cash. We're coming up on the French Revolution, aren't we? So how does this tie in with Paris dropping into random holes in the ground?
Yeah. So the French Revolution, it's an interesting one, how it ties into this story, because I think absolutely the inspection of tunnels is 100% interrupted by the chaos in France, and especially obviously in Paris. Actually, following Guillemot's arrest in 1791, or when he's released from prison in 1791, he's actually not restored to his original post. He's restored to the Inspector General of the quarries outside of Paris. And then we don't see him signing his letters as Inspector of Paris and its surroundings until 1796. So it seems like it took him a few years to get his full title back.
That sucks.
Kind of sucks. Kind of weird.
By which time then? 1796. The shit has hit the fan, hasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. It's quite funny. He starts ending his letters with "Dear citoyen," so "Dear citizens."
Yeah.
There's a definite language change. People are adjusting, but that's kind of my point, I guess, is that while the revolution is certainly an interruption to the work being done, and there's certainly some drama from the revolution, as far as the story of the catacombs relates to the urbanization of Paris and to the kind of built environment, I don't think it would be fair to say the revolution's any type of grand departure. Because well before the revolution in 1777, we see the consolidation of the overlapping jurisdictions of what to do with the tunnels. Is it the Ministry of Finance's job? Is it the police's job? The Ministry of the Bridges and Roads' job? They all have the same kind of responsibilities. And we see this in 1777, before the revolution, get consolidated into the inspection of tunnels, which is what Guillemot does. So I think if we focus kind of solely on the municipalization and the kind of built environment of Paris and how building projects were actually carried out and the relationship that government had with construction, kind of from that perspective, the revolution can pass us by almost unnoticed. So I think both above ground and below ground, there was no real appreciable change due to the revolution. The kind of the policy of one organization carrying out the construction underground was already there. The threat of a collapse of the entire southern side of Paris into the void underneath it, it was a threat to the king just as much as it was to the new republic. That being said, I think Guillemot certainly noticed the revolution as he spent time in prison, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So 1780, the Les Innocents collapses. Is this just another sinkhole? What happened?
Yeah, this is a really interesting case. It is not a sinkhole, but it is why we know the catacombs today as the catacombs. This kind of collapse of Les Innocents, or the Church of the Holy Innocents. So this was the largest and oldest cemetery in Paris. And by the 1750s and 60s, people begin to wonder just how many more bodies could be supported in this churchyard, in this cemetery. Starting in the 14th century, they had to start burying people in the walls of the cemetery in these structures known as charniers. And there was a bunch of controversy about, it smells bad. It's bringing bad air to the urban environment. So there's already some movement kind of to think about maybe moving cemeteries outside of the city. But then after a long period of spring rain in 1780, one of the charniers of Les Innocents gave way and collapsed into the street, and it just spilled a heap of human debris onto the streets of Paris. And that must have been a really grim image to see.
Yeah.
Just generations of humans' remains on the streets.
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit, yeah. So on the 4th of September, the king gave an edict that said all burial in the Les Innocents is to stop immediately. But Paris, of course, had the problem of what do we do with all the dead?
Yeah.
People are
It's
still
much
dying.
like London. It's like you've got to put them somewhere, and it becomes. This is probably ahead of London in terms of running out of space and what to do with people.
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah. So, when life gives you lemons, right? So when life gives you tunnels, make an ossuary. So it was pretty quickly suggested that that's what they should do. And in 1786, they get started. So the mass graves of Les Innocents are emptied out. Bodies are transported every single evening to the municipal ossuary of Paris, which we call the Catacombs. Which the entrance to this is actually on the Rue d'Enfer. It's right next to where the original sinkhole happened. And on the 7th of April, 1786, a small group of clergy and the Charles-Axel Guillemot go and consecrate the catacombs as a proper site for Christian burial. And every evening afterwards, for about 2 years, the nearly 2 million dead that were buried in Les Innocents are moved to the catacombs. So they're moved by torch. The bodies are placed on a covered wagon. Priests are chanting the funeral mass both in front of and behind the wagons, and they're just going by torchlight until the cemeteries are empty.
Incredible. It's a logistical effort, isn't it? Were they maintaining details of who they were moving and when, or was it just like a chuck everybody in the back of the van scenario?
It was very much a chuck everyone in the back of the van scenario. There is none of the bones in the catacombs are really properly identified. And of course, when the revolution happens, a lot more people just get kind of unceremoniously dumped in there as well. So today there's around 7 million people buried underneath Paris. Even Charles-Axel Guillemot is buried in there somewhere. We don't know where, but he is in there.
That's insane that he's ended up down there as well. But who is the Diablo Vert?
This is such a fun and weird topic. So, in case you couldn't tell by my interest in sinkholes and catacombs, I kind of like spooky stuff.
Yeah.
Yep. So, I was reading this book by the author Graham Robb. It's called Parisians, an Adventure History of Paris. And he does actually an entire chapter about the catacombs. And it's pretty good. I would recommend it to anyone who wants to do a little bit more reading about this story and just Paris in general. But he mentions a really interesting story that workers in the tunnels underneath Paris would claim to see footprints in previously uncharted tunnels, and that they would smell a sulfurous smell, and they would see a green figure in the corner of their eyes, and they would run extremely quickly, and it was bad luck to see it. If you saw it, something bad was going to happen to you. And Rob identifies this character as the Homme Vert, or the Green Man. And after that, after I read that, I tried to find some more information, and I couldn't find anything. It was by chance. I was reading about kind of the area around the Rue d'Enfer, and there was this old castle that was built by Robert II of France, and it's located actually on what is now the Jardin de Luxembourg. It's called the Château Vauvert. And there's a phrase actually in French called aller au Vauvert, which basically means go very far away. But shortly after Robert II's death in 1031, the castle was abandoned and it fell into a state of disrepair. And there was this myth that began to kind of happen, like an urban legend in Paris mythology of this green devil, that was the reason the castle was abandoned, was because it was haunted by this green devil. And that's where it lived and haunted the area. So in 1257, King Louis IX gave the castle grounds to the Carthusian order so that they could create a monastery. And there was rumor that he did this because the area was haunted, and he thought if anyone can get rid of the Diablo Vert, it would be the Carthusians. This was all kind of contemporarily happening. So there was this French historian named Jean-Baptiste de Lacan, who was alive in the 1790s. He was saying that it was, he actually said the castle had been abandoned because of the numerous tunnels underneath it caused it to collapse. So kind of saw that coming. this castle was located near the Rue d'Enfer, and it was basically just this myth of this guy who would just haunt around the area. I mean, hell must have its devil, right?
Yep.
So he would go around haunting everything. The castle was destroyed in 1790 and was sold in 1790 and then demolished in 1796. But we have lots of stories that continue long after that. But the existence of the Diable de Vauvert, or the Diable Vert, being so heavily associated with this kind of region of the southern side of Paris is probably why the sinkholes were originally attributed to like this diabolical action. Because interestingly, in the 1820s, there was a story, pardon me, there's a story in the 1820s of a spice shop owner who hears like a clanging around, and then there's actually another collapse. There's another sinkhole, but it's a small one. And he blames it on the devil, on the Diable Vert. So these kind of strong connections between this kind of sinkhole effect, this kind of shaking and spooky sounds, even in the 1820s, there's a conscious associate. He's the Diable Vert is there in the kind of consciousness of Parisians. And perhaps in 1774, it felt that the devil of Vauvert had finally awoken to wreak his vengeance against all of Paris. There are stories of bricks being thrown by mysterious people, or from mysterious directions by nobody, and it was probably the Diable Vauvert. The Diable Vert is just this very heavily associated with this one region of Paris. It's kind of an urban legend. He's like the Sasquatch.
Love it.
What's the risk of one happening now? Do you know?
Yeah. So Paris is deemed safe now, but the work continues to this day. The Inspection Générale des Carrières de Paris, or the inspection of the tunnels of Paris, that organization is still part of the French government today. It still exists, and they're still doing their job of ensuring there is no collapse. I think every neighborhood of Paris is deemed safe, except for Montmartre is deemed to still have some issues to work on. But I wouldn't worry about it if I went to Paris.
Yeah, the likelihood of dropping into a hole is not that great.
Yeah.
Warning people, you will not be dropping into holes if you go to Paris.
Yeah, you will not be. It is safe.
Just make me laugh that the area with the slightly higher risk is where all the tourists are.
Yes, exactly.
Oops, sorry, there go all the Brits.
Yeah, talk about a Brexit, right?
Yeah, taking it literally.
Ian, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, we're so lucky that we clocked you on Twitter, because we asked you to come and join us and talk about sinkholes, something that
Begged.
I didn't actually think that Alex and I would be talking about on this podcast.
It's brilliant, though. What an excellent little snippet of Paris history, though, and we haven't had much on Paris
Exactly.
thus far in this. It's been brilliant.
Oh, yeah, it's been great for me, too. I've really enjoyed talking about this. Always happy to talk about sinkholes or Paris. So this has been a lot of fun for me. Thanks for inviting me.
No worries, and you can now tell your grandchildren that once, when they're bored of hearing about sinkholes, you can say, once 2 women threw themselves at me because of sinkholes.
Yes. There you go. Vindication, finally.
Join us on Monday when Richard Osgood will be with us to talk all about his archaeological hunt for tanks around Bullecourt. This is absolutely brilliant, so don't miss that. I had no idea how cool this story was. Don't forget that we do exist on Patreon as History Hack and on Patreon as well, which is Podbean's own version. Alina and I have had massive fun doing this in 2020, but life's going to change quite a lot next year and we're going to actually have to go and earn a living, etc. If we want to keep up the regularity that we've been bringing you and the kind of guests that we've been bringing you and the workload, then we will need your help. There's going to be incentives for joining on either of those platforms. We're revamping ourselves on both of them, so don't forget to go in. You can do as little as $1 a month and it all goes towards keeping up History Hack as regular as we've been able to bring it to you this year.
We are now on YouTube. We are posting all of our new episodes on there, and we have our own channel, and we are gradually posting all of the back episodes because we have been made aware of the fact that you can only find the last 100 on some platforms. So you can go and listen to your heart's content and laugh at the cartoons and have a great time. So do go over there and subscribe.